I'm honoured to be interviewing Miles Axe Copeland III, founder of IRS Records, the label which introduced the Go-Go's, the Bangles, the Cramps, and REM, among others, to the world. Miles, of course, is also famous for managing the Police, a now iconic rock trio who might not have made it at all had it not been for Miles' tenacious energy, taking the song Roxanne to A&M Records and making them an offer they couldn't refuse. "You can have it for free," he said, "just give us your best royalties." The rest is history. This and other hard-earned lessons in negotiation and the snakes and ladders of the entertainment industry can be found in Miles' new book, Two Steps Forward, One Step Back, My Life in the Music Business. Miles joins me now from France, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with him about his career, the music industry, and of course, the police. Miles, I want to open with this question. You're known to be in command of the room, this kind of unflappable guy prepared for anything. When was the last time you were truly surprised?
Well, probably a lot of times, really, at least one hopes. But, I think, you could say somebody is unflappable, but if it sort of infers that they're, nothing happens to ever bug them. But I think that everybody in their lifetime is going to be confused or worried or have a problem at some point, And in a way, that's sort of what the title of the book is about. Two steps forward, one step back is sort of a realization that no matter how smart you are, how successful you are, whatever, you're going to have mistakes, which are those steps backward, and that, those are part of what the game is, and you can almost learn as much from a mistake as you can from a success. And I wanted the book to make sure that I covered things like, the mistakes as well as the successes, because I didn't want it to be just a book where I would be kind of like waving the flag saying, well, this is what I did and aren't I great? I wanted to say also that, I screwed up quite a few times. That was part of the point of it. And I learned from every one of those screw ups.
That's something I really like about the book, Miles, is that it doesn't feel like a curation of your life experiences. It's very much a book about the fact that mistakes are just as important as the successes. It reminds me of something that Sting talked about, a conversation he had with Gil Evans at one point, talking about mistakes, and it was about musical mistakes and the idea that, well, it's actually the note that you play next that's the important one, which lets the audience know whether you've made a mistake or not.
A lot of the great inventions were mistakes. Somebody in a laboratory, puts the wrong chemical in, and all of a sudden some new thing happens. So mistakes are part of life, really. And what turns out to be a mistake for one turns out to be a success for another.
I want to cast your mind back to the deep, dark 90s when you did a interview with another famous manager, Ed Bicknell. And you joked that if you ever wrote a book, you said it'll have a brown cover and its title will be People Are Shit. And you said that's because you should never underestimate the villainy of an artist or anyone else, so you're not surprised when you get screwed. And I think your book is a lot more optimistic than that. I think right down to its title, as you were just talking about. So, would you say that your outlook has changed since then?
Well, I have said to people since, when they say, well, that's a pretty, sorry way of looking at life. I say, well, actually, if you approach everything thinking it's going to be great and it isn't, then you're disappointed, But if you approach everything thinking, well, it's going to screw up and, people are shit and don't expect the best of everybody, and every now and then somebody comes through and does something great, then you're pleasantly surprised. So I'd rather live in a world of pleasant surprises than, being subjected to constant reminders about the villainy of people, So in a way, I look about it as a positive statement, not a negative statement.
In that same interview, you told Ed that you're an embarrassed Republican, and 25 or so years later, how would you describe the state of the Republican Party and politics in America?
Well, if I was an embarrassed Republican then, I'm a super embarrassed Republican now, because it's a party that is no longer relevant to what America was. And it certainly is not relevant to any principles which the Republican Party was founded on, So, today I would call myself a Democrat, and largely because there is no such thing as a Republican Party as we once knew it.
I have for some time wondered if the Democratic Party, with all of their corporate ties and alliances, have kind of become like the GOP of 30 years ago, whereas the GOP today is like the Trump Party.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think the reality of politics is that, money talks. And one of the unfortunate things about the American system is if you're a congressman, for instance, you get elected for 2 years. And, the day you get elected is the day you start basically trying to raise money for the next election, So you spend your whole life basically chasing money. And of course, there are plenty of people with their hand out with cash in it. And those people tend to be lobbyists and corporations that have the money and want something for it, So you as a congressman sometimes get forced to say yes to people that you might not otherwise like to, but that's just the way the system works. So, as somebody once said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
Just touching upon Vietnam for a moment, in your book, you talk about having high arches, so you weren't recruited, and I'm interested in your reflections on that. And if your brother Ian spoke to you very much about his experiences, I'm thinking about that war. Has America learned anything?
Well, my brother Ian, who I miss dearly, wrote his own memoir called Wild Thing. And the first part of it is his experience in Vietnam, which I found to be the most interesting part of the book, actually. And, when I got rejected, in a way, I was disappointed because I figured, well, joining the Army and it would be an experience that I probably should have. But, it was during the Vietnam War, which was not a particularly popular war. And certainly, most people tried to avoid it. And you had all sorts of, I had a lot of friends who were advising me what to do to get rejected, But I reported for duty like a good American, and I expected to be in the Army. And I was shocked when I was the only one of 2,000 people to get rejected because of high arches. So my reflections are really that it's probably an experience I'm glad not to have had. And whether America learned something from it or not, I think we probably did not.
Crossing over into the music industry, Miles, I was interested in talking with you about the subject of art versus formula. And in your book, you talk a lot about songwriting, the formula, and there are lots of conversations in there with artists and producers about the importance of those hooks. When does art transcend formula from a commercial perspective?
The idea is that there are certain formulas. By saying something is a formula doesn't necessarily mean it's restricted into a little box. But to know what the essence of what works and what doesn't work, to know the parameters of a box, you can think outside of it and inject something from the outside, which basically works within the formula, but adds something to it. And I think that's what I learned from the songwriting thing is that, the mind does expect certain things to happen in a sequence. You expect, it's a verse, chorus, break, verse, chorus. That's the sort of standard of every song. But that doesn't mean that every song is going to be the same, But basically, when the chorus is supposed to happen, your mind is expecting something to lift at that point. If it doesn't happen, you turn off and you'll change channels, So in a way, we all are subjected and we all operate under some sort of formula, whether we know it or not. But the secret is you throw in a monkey wrench to that formula, which makes it special. And that's what I try to do during the songwriter retreat. So I would take some formula people out of Nashville who were very much worked within this sort of box. And I would throw in somebody that was a punk person or a rock person from the outside. And then all of a sudden you'd end up with something special because the formula was jolted, it was perverted, and it became special that way. But it was still basically a formula.
I was really interested in reading about Sting's albums, Mercury Falling and Brand New Day, in your book. And what I want to ask about there is your perspective on why artists as successful as Sting should be concerned at all with record sales and charts once they hit, 40 or 50, especially if they've already made it as a member of a band and as a solo artist.
Well, the truth is they don't have to worry about it. Their bank account's going to be fine. They're going to get royalties forever, But there's the ego involved. So I'm sure Sting would if you said to him, do you care if your record's number one or not? He'd probably say, no, I don't care. But really, everybody cares. If you have a number one record, it's better than having no record at all, So I think that even though an artist might say, well, I don't really care if I'm going to be in the charts anymore, they all want to be in the charts.
I wondered if the pressure to hit the top 40 again could be, at the expense of just enjoying the freedom of having become successful as an artist. And in that, I wondered if Sting might have found the process of making Mercury Falling a richer creative experience than of just writing more of those hook-laden hits.
Well, my own view was that I think that he recognized the fact that the Mercury Falling was a good album, but it wasn't as good as it could have been had he not been a bit more focused with regard to the formula that's necessary to make a hit. And that's really was my role, to come and remind him that, look, it doesn't mean that an album has to be worse if you make a few concessions to the reality that, you need a song that's going to get on the radio or people are not going to hear your music, And with Brand New Day album and Desert Rose in the end, we did get on the radio. And he had a very, very successful album. And of course, it boosted his career. So I think that, whether he creatively liked Mercury Falling more than Brand New Day, I doubt whether he would look at it in those terms. I think he likes every record that he makes, but he was content. And I will say one thing for Sting is that if he says, look, I'll pay the price of a mistake, he means it. And there are a lot of artists that don't mean it. They want to blame somebody if there's a mistake made. Well, Sting never blamed anybody.
I really like your reflections on what you've talked about in your book about some conversations about producers. I'm talking about Hugh Padgham, who's an amazing producer and, one of my favorites. And, one associates Hugh Padgham with those amazing Genesis albums, those amazing Police albums. And of course, you talk about Hugh Padgham working with Sting, I think, on Mercury Falling. And you ask the question, isn't the producer the guy that's actually supposed to talk to the artist and say, well, hang on, maybe we should arrange it this way? And, it raised some questions for me about the role of a producer. And that was pretty fascinating. And of course, Hugh Padgham, that was his last album he made with Sting, I think, Mercury Falling.
Yeah, because really, I look upon a producer as somebody that helps the artist achieve the best of what they can do. It's Hugh, in the case of Sting, he really played the role of an engineer. He simply put down what Sting wanted, and he didn't inject his own recommendations, and I think that was the mistake. Hugh, you rightly say, is a great producer when he actually has something to say, and he says, with some of these other artists, he might very well have put his 2 cents forward. In the case of Sting, his attitude was, well, how can I tell Sting how to write a song? Well, because that's the job of a producer, at least to say, by the way, what about doing it this way? The artist will decide in the end, but at least the producer can nudge him in the right direction. But in the case of Mercury Falling, Hugh decided that he would do no nudging. He would simply put down what Sting wanted. And I think that was a disservice to both Sting himself and to the public, who because I think a lot of those songs on Mercury Falling could have been very well could have been hits, but weren't.
Miles, you're known as a powerhouse manager who's rattled hundreds of promoters and journalists and other unfortunates with a stern look. I wondered, who have you been intimidated or in awe of in your life?
Well, I would not say I was in awe or intimidated by anybody in the music business, but there are certain people that I respect. Obviously, Winston Churchill comes to mind, World War II, he basically went against the grain of everybody and stood up and saved England, in my view. I have a lot of nice thoughts about Margaret Thatcher, which might surprise some people, but I had, various meetings with people who had worked with her. And I came to understand that she was also a person who really thought carefully about what she was supposed to do and went against the grain when she believed that was the right thing to do. And I had respect for that. But, I don't know that in the music business, people like Jerry Moss, of course, I have great respect for. And well, I guess in the music business, the one person that I really would have to say I respected, who I did not really believe I would have beforehand, was Bruce Springsteen. And that happened on a tour where I realized that he understood extremely well what his audience expected of him. And he wasn't too proud to give it to them. And I thought that was something that was quite special.
You've described the entertainment business as one in which people are put in a situation that gets totally perverted and disturbed, and not every act can deal with it very well. And more recently, you've talked about how it's the people around the artist which changes over time. So when an artist is surrounded by people who are afraid of telling them the truth or challenging their ideas, how does that affect them?
Well, I think that it's a recipe for an artist becoming less significant, because if no one will tell them the truth, not everybody, myself included, is going to make the right decision every time. Sometimes you need somebody from the outside saying, "Excuse me, have you thought of this?" Or, "You know what? I think you might be wrong in this circumstance. You need to look at it this way." But if everybody around are going, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Everything you do is great, sir." Who needs anybody around you? So I think that, I know I would have benefited of having listened to people that were around me. I'm sure Sting benefited by my, putting my thoughts forward. Certainly the Police did. But I know artists that have failed because they were never told what they should have been told, And I know from artists, that I had tried to make deals with, that sometimes they don't really want to hear the truth, and it's artists like that I don't really have a lot of time for, because I realize that if somebody doesn't want to hear the truth, you know what, they're not going to get the truth. But you need the truth to move forward in life.
Well, it seems like the wrong kind of client for you, because that's how you come across, is as someone who's a straight shooter.
Yeah, and I think, when I come across an artist who really wants me to tell them what they want to hear, I kind of lose interest. It's happened to be a number of times where an artist will say, "Well, you're the guy I want. I want a tough guy," then they'll play me a song and say, "Well, that's the hit single." And I go, "Well, actually, I don't think it is." And then, of course, I find the relationship doesn't work from there, because they thought that my job was to be a tough guy and to push something through that they wanted. And I'd say, "Well, that's not what my job is. My job is to push forward what I think should go forward, and to then tell you what I think when it shouldn't go forward, And if you don't want to listen to my advice, well, then, get somebody else."
It's also an odd definition of tough, isn't it? I would think that actually being tough and being brave is actually telling the truth about things.
Yeah, and I the reality is that, a lot of people want to be told what they want to hear. And it's true not just in music business, it's certainly true in politics.
Yeah.
I heard stories, for instance, which made me think that why Margaret Thatcher turned out to be a great prime minister, because she went against everybody in the cabinet, for instance. and stuck to her guns on something she believed, because one person in the cabinet said, look, I believe this. And she, went with that person against everybody else, and it's not easy to do. It's not easy to buck the system in a way, but every now and then, if your gut tells you this is the right way to go, I respect the view that people decide that that's what to do. And I think, one of the great documentaries I saw, or one of the great movies, was when Steve Jobs was saying what Apple should do, and they all rejected him, and he got fired. And later, of course, the company went into the toilet and they rehired him, But it was a great testament is that he was visionary. He stuck to his guns. He knew what the future needed to be, and he turned out to be right.
When you were talking about Thatcher just now, I was actually thinking about Joe Biden, and say what you will about him. His decision on Afghanistan is certainly one that he's got to know is not going to make him miss the popularity with the Pentagon. I'm certainly observing that there's some sticking to some inner beliefs and convictions taking place there as well.
Well, I support the view that we get out, because here's the truth. Whether we leave today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 5 years in the past, whatever, the same would happen. I grew up in the Middle East, and I know very well that, I don't care what we do, unless we really went in and bombed the shit out of it, totally flattened the place and killed half the population like we did in Germany or Japan, you're really not going to change stuff. You can't do things half measures. So we had no business being in Afghanistan. And whether, getting out now, it made, they say, well, we'll look at the problem of women or this or that. If we left in 2 years from now, the same thing would happen, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. So you know what? Why does America have to lose treasure and lives to have the same result? Somebody once told me, if you do the same thing over and over again and you get the same result, you know what? Maybe you're making a mistake. And I think Joe Biden had to own up to the fact that, you know what? We've been doing this for 20 years. We've gotten nowhere. So, you know what? Let's face the fact we made a mistake, and let's get out. And look what happened. Of course, it was a matter of weeks when the Taliban took over. I mean, That just goes to show that we had no impact whatsoever on Afghanistan.
And of course, I think to a large degree, because of the way the media has covered this, his popularity has dropped in the weeks since he made what is arguably a really good decision for the American people.
Well, I think, history will tell, I think for many leaders, and Biden is one of them, Thatcher was one, Winston Churchill was one, you can face negative, bad news for a period. It's really posterity. How will you be looked on 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And I think Joe Biden, if we look at it from the perspective of 10 years from now, people will be saying, you know what, the guy was right.
Yep. So as someone who's a discerning pragmatist, let's say, who calls a spade, it would seem, Miles, that you found yourself working in an industry that in some ways could be described as anathema to your way of thinking, because with success comes fame, and with fame comes distortions of reality. And that all seems in some ways a paradoxical equation. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think success of any kind changes things, out of necessity or just reality, and so my thoughts are, I don't really overthink things. I do things that I believe in, and you move forward. And if it's a success, great. I've had a lot of records that I really like that were not that successful, but I'm still proud that I did them. You can't run life thinking that you have to make a success of everything. I think as long as you've got some successes, and some things you really like to have done, I think sometimes you might find that some of your failures were some of your favorite things, and I think that's certainly in the case for me. That was certainly true. So I don't know how I would answer that question, really. I would say basically, it is what it is.
How does a manager keep an artist grounded, particularly when they're becoming very successful?
with great difficulty.
Good
No,
answer.
it is sometimes very difficult because, some manager once told me, he said, look, when you sign an artist and you're like a big time manager, you're like a god. You can walk on water. You're the bee's knees. When the artist happens, you're the janitor. Which means, of course, the artist then assumes that their success is because they did it, not because you did it. It is because they were super talented, not because you did some magical whatever, And that's just the reality of things, So, getting credit where credit is due is really not what managers are going to. If you want to get credit, don't be a manager, Be an artist, So in a way, I rejected doing a book because I did not want to basically be in a situation where I was trying to get credit for the things that I had done. In some ways, what I was trying to do was correct some of the mistakes that people had made when they write about the police. I mean, I had one journalist tell me, "Oh, tell me about the gig that the police did in Thailand." And I'd say, well, actually, we never did do that gig because we had to cancel it because, Sting's throat went and he stayed in Australia. And the journalist said, oh, but it's in all the books that the police did Thailand. And I said, well, we never did do Thailand. He said, yeah, but if I don't mention it in the book I'm writing about the police, people will think I didn't do my research. And so I have to mention the fact that the police did Thailand. I said, yes, but the police did not play Thailand, period. Sting was sick. His voice was gone. We didn't do it. Later on, I get the book. Sure enough, the police played Thailand.
Speaking of credit, one thing I'll say is that the police appear to be an exception to that rule of not giving the manager credit, because for anyone who's a police fan, you play such a prominent role in their story, and where there have been police pieces done on video in the past, there's always some form of dedication to you in there, because it's well known through history that it might not have happened if not for your management and for what you brought to the group.
Well, I think I was lucky in that way. I mean, the police, for instance, going way back to, Stuart. I tell it the story in the book as Stuart thought the whole thing was coming to an end, and I said, "Well, let's make an album," And then they didn't want to play me Roxanne because they thought it was an anti-punk thing. It was a sweet ballad basically, and that I would hate it. And I listened to that song and I thought, well, guys, that's the one that's going to change our lives. And they were shocked that I liked this song, And I then took them to America, and I had a lot of the successes of the police were because of ideas that I came up with. And thankfully, there've been a couple of writers who have credited me with, the best ideas that the police had. Well, I find that, flattering, but the reality is, if Sting didn't write hits, if the band weren't a great band, they wouldn't have been successful. So I was certainly, 25% of the success, but I wasn't more than that. If Sting had not written hit songs, I could have been a brilliant manager. Still, it wouldn't have happened, So, Stuart being a great drummer, Andy being a great guitar player, and all the ingredients kind of came together and made the police what they were. And I was, admittedly one of those ingredients.
We will talk about the police shortly. So I want to ask you about another quote from it's actually a recent interview, one of your interviews you did for your book, which was, I hate to watch myself in film or listen to myself in interviews. And plenty of people, including some of the world's best actors, feel that way and don't like watching themselves. And having worked with so many artists yourself, many of whom you helped make famous, how would you explain this phenomenon of the brilliant performer who feels uncomfortable watching their own work?
Well, I think you probably always noticing the mistakes you make, and so you rather avoid looking at yourself in those situations, because, ooh, I slurred that word, or, I shouldn't have said that, or, I think, well, for me, it's sort of like, I don't like the idea of boasting. And by watching yourself, in a way, it's like I'm boasting. I want to see what I did, well, I kind of don't want to do that. It's just a quirk, I'm sure some people like watching what they do, but I don't particularly, and I can sympathize with actors who don't want to watch either, because, it's like boasting in a way. It's like, I want to see how good I am, well, I am what I am. That's just the reality.
No, that's entirely fair enough. And you're kind of describing the human condition in some ways there as well, I think, Miles. When Warner's offered REM double whatever whatever you were offering, which is a great story you tell in the book about REM, and it was in the millions by that point, and you basically congratulated the band and said, take the offer while it's still on the table. Where I'm going with this is, you've had to handle a lot of unwieldy egos, and I'm thinking about the manager's ego, because there have to have been times when you felt thwarted, or your ideas disparaged, or you've been undercut. And REM were obviously a really important band to the label, and you were totally realistic about the situation, and there was no way that you guys could meet what Warner's were offering. And it's like, you were actually thrilled for the band, told them to take the money and run. And I'm wondering, do you just have a really positive attitude, or how do you keep yourself afloat through those times?
Well, I think the case of REM was very special, because they'd never caused any problem all the way through the contract. And when you really look at all the contracts that IRS Records had, they were the only act that fulfilled the entire contract and did all the albums they were supposed to do. So one could hardly be angry at REM for anything, And when they got the best record deal I ever saw, I had to realize that part of the reason they got it was the success that we had given them. And in a way, it was me and my team saying, guys, you've done something amazing and you should benefit for it. And you know what? We're going to bask in the glory a bit as well, which we did, of course. We were part of the reason REM got that amazing deal. And, it wasn't just me. It was, Michael Plen, the radio promoter. It was Jay Boberg. It was these people that had faith in them from the beginning. It was really an IRS effort. And I was very glad for the group that they got this big deal. And I said so in the book,
Yeah, that's a great attitude. And obviously it's very gratifying that happened, is what you're saying. In reference to Pat McDonald of Timbuk 3, his refusal to take millions of dollars to allow the classic "The Future's So Bright, I've Got to Wear Shades," his refusal to allow that to be used in a commercial. And I'm also thinking about Sting with "Don't Stand So Close to Me" in a deodorant commercial. I wanted to ask you about the concept of selling out, and ask, why don't artists just offset such corporate deals by saying, okay, we'll do the Pepsi commercial, but 75% of my cut goes to charity or goes to research for something?
Well, I don't know why an artist has to say, well, because I do a commercial, that all of a sudden I have to give the money away. I mean, I don't understand that rationale. It's one of the ways you make money out of the music business. And in the case of Pat McDonald, I mean, this was a guy that, Timbuk 3 were marginally successful, and they certainly weren't the success of the Police, but they were successful enough, and they had a life, but they didn't own a fancy house, and they didn't have a lot of money in the bank. So in the case of Pat McDonald, accepting, $1 million, he meant he could have bought a house. What a great thing for I mean, that's part of the stepping stones of success. I wanted him to have that success, but he looked upon it as selling out. And I'd say, well, why is it selling out? Ray-Ban is a good product. Obviously, if it had been for like a cigarette commercial, or it had been for some deodorant, or it had been for some, Tampax or something, okay, you could say you're just doing it for the money. But, we do a lot of things for the money. Most people's jobs they do for the money. Not everybody likes to be doing what they're doing, and why does an artist have to give away some of the income from a song that they've come up with that some commercial company thinks, wow, that's a cool thing? Why did Sting have to give away money for a Desert Rose? Well, no, I mean, Jaguar was a cool product, and you know what? It saved Jaguar, So I've never been somebody that believed in this whole idea of selling out. To me, selling out is when you do something only for the money and it's against the interests of your image and what you stand for. And I don't think, the future so bright doing a commercial with Ray-Ban, would have been a bad thing for Timbuk3, and wouldn't have called it selling out. I would have think, most of the fans of Timbuk3 would say, well, good on you. You got yourself a house. Finally, you made some money out of this business.
I want to talk with you a little bit about the music industry today. And you said that not a lot has changed because it's still about getting noticed first, and then it can be about the music. But a closer look at the phenomenon of Spotify shows that here we have a precedent that's been set, which devalues creativity to the point where you literally need millions of streams to be paid anything approaching a tangible return. And the artists that get those numbers are the ones who are pushed by the big labels, who are now global conglomerates with, about as much interest in creativity as Hollywood studios are interested in original stories. And Spotify has even got plans to get their foot into the door of the concert market and do streaming concerts, which could see independent artists earning even less than they do now. So I wonder, because creativity in music has become even less financially viable than it was before streaming platforms took over, I wonder, from a major label perspective, I wonder, how has music become content? And I'm thinking about.
Let me interrupt you here, because let's go back a few years, okay?
Yeah.
Let's keep in mind that on a good day, 1 out of 10 signings succeeded. Okay. So it's always been the case that 90% of the artists that sign to a major label or to any label at all have success. And that's on a good day. Probably the percentage is even worse. Maybe it's, 3 or 4% come through and make some real money. For every artist that gets a big record in the charts, there are plenty that don't get anywhere. So it's always been the case that most artists, if they get an advance from a record company, it's probably the last bit of money they'll ever see. That's always been the case. The other thing about the Spotify issue is that, I would have agreed with you several years ago, but I talked to somebody who was very knowledgeable of the situation with regard to companies like Spotify. And they said, look, when Spotify started, it's very true. They're paying 0.00001 cent or something per play. It's peanuts. So if you get, 1 million plays, you're going to make, 52 cents, basically, He said, but that was really the situation when it all started. He said, but now imagine you've got 9 or 10 billion people listening to your song. That 1.00001 cent times 9 or 10 billion adds up to real money. And he said, we used to never make any money out of Africa. We get 0 royalties from Africa 30 years ago. So now, even though it's not a huge amount of money, that if you want to listen to Spotify on your telephone, on your iPhone or whatever it is, your phone, you have to pay a little bit of royalty goes into the system. Now, Africa actually does pay artists royalties, even though they're not huge. At least it's something. We never made that before. So we lose one way, we make another. But I think the reality of the streaming is that the potential of the quantity of people is so vast now that you multiply these infinitesimal amounts of percentage times several billion, and it actually does add up to money. So I haven't seen my royalties that I get for the police, and I'm sure, Sting's royalties and a lot of big artists' royalties have not diminished over time, even though records of, we're having fewer and fewer physical records being sold. CDs are gone, basically. The royalties aren't going down. If anything, they're going up slightly, because the quantity of people who can now access a song is so vast that it's the sheer size of things that make a difference.
How would you say an artist can get attention in a world in which overexposure is not even possible anymore, and the news cycle is the shortest it's ever been?
Well, I would say the best way is to look at Donald Trump, look at Kiss, look at Lady Gaga, look at Elton, look at a lot of the artists who succeeded. I mean, go back to the days of the Who. They got attention mainly because they smashed their equipment on stage. Kiss got attention because they painted their faces and looked like devils, and Gene Simmons spit blood. Alice Cooper got attention because he bit the head off of chickens. Elton John got attention because he was wild and wore wild clothes and huge glasses and jumped on his piano. Lady Gaga wore wild clothes. So a lot of artists have Elvis Presley was wiggling on stage, freaking everybody out because it was so shocking that an artist would wiggle in front of the TV. The Beatles had long hair. The Animals didn't wash. You go down the list. That a lot of the famous. The first thing I heard about the Animals was they never bathed. Wasn't true, but that's the first thing I heard.
Well, if it bleeds, it leads.
It got attention.
Yeah. I was thinking, quite cynically, I was thinking, can you imagine what those Roxanne royalties might have looked like if A&M worked more like Spotify back in 1978?
Well, I think the reality is that success breeds success. If you have a record that's huge on Spotify, maybe you don't make as much money through streaming, but now you're going to make it on merchandise. So you make it in concerts, you make it some other way. And now it's much more acceptable to accept money from a sponsor, So, once we did Desert Rose, all of a sudden it became acceptable to do commercials, Then you saw Celine Dion and the Rolling Stones and various others accept commercials because if Sting did it, well, it must be okay, So, there are plenty of ways to make money out of the entertainment business. It may not always be music. And if you think about it, take CBS, NBC, and ABC. On the surface, they make programs, but that's not how they make money. They make money selling advertising. They are, in effect, in the advertising business. But we would look at them and say, well, they're programmers. They program programs. Well, no, their money is in advertising. So they're making money from something that has nothing to do with their job, in a sense. And that's the case of a lot of things. You make money. It's like you can sell something for free or give something away for free. It's like the old days when they said the oil companies would give away oil lamps for free so you'd buy the oil. But that's the reality of business. Sometimes you could say, well, look, I'm going to give away something for free. Stores do it. I remember in one promotion, the Best Buy or one of these chain stores, said, well, we're going to give away videos and sell them less than it costs us to buy them to entice people into the store. So we'll lose $1 million on a video of Star Wars, but we're hoping that people, once they're in the store, will buy a refrigerator, because that's where we're making our real money, is selling refrigerators. So, you know, there are a lot of businesses that make their money from something other than what the frontline business would appear to be, called a loss leader, in a sense. So, you know, an act can say, well, I'm making no money from Spotify. Well, what are you making from concerts? What are you making from merchandise? You know, I mean, the Grateful Dead were giving away music for free, as I talk about in the book. They figured, well, why not give the music away for free? Because we're not going to sell records anyway. So let's look good and let everybody record the music willy-nilly. They can have it for free. But we'll make our money on ticket sales and on merchandise. And they did. They were the biggest grossing act in the United States.
All right. So being an Aussie, I have to ask, were there any Australian artists that you would have jumped at had they been in the US when you were running IRS Records?
Well, I probably would have gone for In Excess. I did work with those guys. I like those guys. There were some acts that actually sounded quite a bit like the Police, you know. But you know, I never really looked upon you know, where an act came from. To me, it was whether I liked the music or not. I mean, you know, I went for a lot of acts that came out of France that were actually Arab acts. You know, they were what they call the Rai movement. It was Algerian Arabs who lived in France, you know, singing in half in Arabic and half in French, you know. I liked acts I heard out of Germany. I liked acts that I heard out of Africa, you know, or rock and Espanol acts that came out of Latin America or something. Or, you know, Manu Chao, who's one of my favorite artists, who is a Frenchman who sings in Spanish, and I think is one of the most creative artists there is, you know. And, you know, so I've never been one to look to a country to provide music. To me, it's like, I don't care where the music comes from. Do I like it or don't I like it? End of story.
Yeah. Well, before we jump into a few questions about the Police, I wanted to ask, in editing the book, is there a story or an experience that almost made the cut, but you had to serve the book, you had to leave it out?
Well, there were a lot of stories that I maybe reduced a little bit because, you know, do you want to drag people through the minutia of stuff that is really only interesting to the aficionado of something. Whereas, you know, sometimes it's like, you know, you tell a joke and if you explain the punchline, you lose the effect of the joke, you know? So sometimes when you write a book, you have to think about the end user, you know. Are you going to write something that's going to be entertaining? You want them to read the book, you know. So some things that you might want to put in for your personal reason, you think, well, you know, do people really care, you know? And I think the essential points are in the book, you know. And I there are some acts that I left out that I think, well, were my personal favorites at the time, but you know, time has moved on, and do I really need people to have to, you know, I'm not writing an essay on every single thing I did. I'm writing on the things that people would be interested in or that have a relevance for the music business today, or that you can learn something from. I mean, that really was a lot of the decision-making for my part is, look, is this relevant to something? If somebody reads this, will they learn something from it? It wasn't just, well, you know, this act was great. I thought they were great, but nobody else did. That wasn't really why I write the book. I would much rather people read the book and go at the end of it, wow, I can apply a lot of what I've learned to a restaurant business or to indeed any business, not just the music business. So, you know, I wrote the book from the standpoint of I wanted it to be entertaining. I wanted it to be informative. I wanted people that were fans to get something out of it. But I also wanted people that were going to hope to learn something from it to get something out of it as well.
That makes sense. For whatever it's worth, I could happily read an entire book about your Middle East experiences. That was probably my favorite part of the book, reading about that part of your life. And if you were to write more, I'd be putting my hand up and saying, yeah, let's hear more about that.
Well, I could always write more. I actually, one of the great stories of my family was my father overthrowing the Syrian government inadvertently and back in 1948. And actually, I wrote to my publisher and I said, look, there's been so much talk about what Trump is doing, basically trying to overthrow the Constitution, and and you've got Miramar, and you've got all these sort of things happening, and my father actually can be credited with overthrowing a government, so I thought, well, my next book should be how to overthrow a government. And I started actually writing it, taking a leaf out of my father's book, because in effect, what he did was he sat down with the general and they discussed sort of intellectually how you'd overthrow a government. And before he knew it, the general he was talking to decided, well, you know what, we can do this. And so they did. But, you're thinking, well, today, what would it take to overthrow a government? And it turns out it's not that difficult.
That's a great idea for a book, I have to say. I hope you write that book. Now, before we jump into the police, I just want to check with you how you're going for time there, Miles.
I've got my time is your time.
Beautiful. Okay. I appreciate that a lot. Let's talk about the police. I want to preface my next question just with a declaration of my own position, which is that as a songwriter who's been in bands myself, I totally understand how frustrating it is to have an arrangement and then to have to make compromises. And to be honest, I'm surprised that we got 5 albums from those guys in the first place. And it always made perfect sense to me that they called it a day when they did, especially when they had achieved what they'd achieved. In your book, Miles, you've succinctly unpacked the myth that Sting, Andy, and Stewart were always fighting, and you remind us of that old but true adage that if it bleeds, it leads. But as far back as 1990, in that graded interview with Ed Bicknell, you talked about having to intervene as Sting and Stewart left the CBGB stage in '78, telling them to get back on stage and play their encore. And I was wondering, what did they have to fight about after less than a year together?
Well, I think part of the experience of some of those situations is really that your energy level is so pumped, and you're getting adulation from the audience, or you're unexpectedly going down exceedingly well, and you're super excited. So, your reaction to everybody is going to probably be overheated, whereas, where you're in a calm situation in a bus driving along and you're a little tired or whatever it is, you're going to be in a different situation. But I think when everything around you is happening and everybody's excited and buzzed, sometimes you're a little buzzed yourself, and I think in that particular case in CBGB's, was one of those moments in which, I think it was really the adrenaline was flowing in all three of them, and it might have overflown a little bit, and that those sort of things happen, and that's part of why the police was successful, is they did have adrenaline flowing in them, and they did get excited, and I think if they didn't, they wouldn't have been as successful.
It sounds like they had fun on their first couple of records, and then as Sting grew as a songwriter, the dynamic changed. And Stewart and Andy could recognize that Sting wrote the best songs, but they weren't content to be session players. They wanted to put their stamp on the music. And this obviously came to a head when Synchronicity was recorded. As their manager, and bearing in mind that you're also the drummer's brother, how did you work through those creative tensions with the band, or did you stay right out of it?
Well, you couldn't stay right out of it totally, but you had to be very fair. Or, I mean, the reality was with Sting, for instance, I couldn't say side with my brother when I knew he was wrong. I mean, he hated every breath you take, because the drumming is, every breath. It was basically the drum machine, And I had to say, Stewart, that's the hit. And he would be, upset because really wasn't a lot for him to do in the song. And it's the same was true for Debbie Peterson when we did Walk Like an Egyptian with the Bangles, I mean, the reality is if you listen to Walk Like an Egyptian, there's not much of a drum part there, So what does she do during the song? So from an artist standpoint, ego does play a role. But from the artistic standpoint, the manager, I had to basically side with Sting and say, look, that's the song, and it does need a simple drum part, and that's what it is, And Stewart would own up today to say, well, I was right, and Sting was right. He always says, he had the fingers and I had the ears, So, but that doesn't mean to say that he as a musician still would have rather put, a few more littles or some whatever drum little bits in the song, But the reality was the song didn't need it, Sometimes if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
I talked to Hugh Padgham a while ago about the Montserrat sessions where Ghost and Synchronicity were recorded, of course, and he described another element to the dynamic which he observed, which is that Stewart had his own unique investment in the group as its founder. And it was his baby in the early years, and then cut to 1982, and Sting has laid everything out in his demos, and struggling to cede creative control of his really carefully thought out musical choices to his bandmates. Is that reflection from Hugh Padgham, is that how you describe the dynamic, or was that just a producer's perspective?
Well, I think the reality was that Sting looked upon his songs as his babies, and he wanted them to sound a particular way. And the reality was Stewart recognized the fact that Sting wrote the hit songs, but he also recognized the fact that he started the group and had the vision in the beginning and the whole thing. So there was a little bit of a conflict within him as to, where's this all going? And do I still have the same role to play, So I think there was a little bit of a conflict. And I think that's probably the reason that Sting decided to do a solo album, was that would give him greater control of his songs, which was, I think, at that point in time for the Police, he was obviously the guy writing the hit songs, and he wanted it to be a particular way, and it didn't always marry well with Stewart. And there was going to be a conflict, and I think that Hugh's recollection is probably accurate.
On the Synchronicity sessions, Hugh said that he once tried to stop an argument and was properly shot down by the band. He said, "You don't know us, stay out of it." And things got worse. And he described a crisis meeting at the studio, which you attended. Is there anything you remember about a meeting happening in which was the kind of make or break Synchronicity meeting at the time?
The only thing I do remember is there was some arguments about Every Breath You Take, and I took the position that Sting was correct, that the song was the hit song, and that that effectively in that particular circumstance I agreed with Sting that the song was correct, and that's the way we should go. And that's just the way it was, I think everybody had basically accepted that reality. And he didn't seem to be, as I remember, that pushy. I think he probably also recognized the reality that it really wasn't a matter of him, because there was a guitar part in it, But I think Stewart had a problem brewing within him, in that he did see the Police as his band, and it really was becoming more Sting's band, because Sting wrote the hits and was the face of the group.
In the documentary Under the Volcano, have you seen that yet, by the way?
No.
It's a documentary about George Martin's Air Studios in Montserrat. And in there's an interview with Andy in which he relates a story of how he asked George Martin about producing Synchronicity. And he was told, look, I think you guys can work this out for yourselves, which, according to Andy, they did. Do you remember any conversations about potentially bringing in George Martin to produce that record?
No.
I've asked Stuart and Andy what advice they would give themselves in 1982 at the height of their tensions if they could have such a conversation. And looking back, I wondered, what advice would you give yourself had you been at the studio before a note was laid down on that record?
Well, I think that the reality was it was what it was. I mean, there was an obvious discrepancy between Stewart's vision of what the police was or had been and where Sting was going. And, Sting later on, I mean, when he separated and did his solo stuff, I carried on as his manager because he knew he needed advice. I carried on with as Stewart's manager as well, and helped him get into soundtracks.
And Andy as well, right?
And Andy as well, I mean, I had less success with Andy because he wouldn't listen to the same degree as Sting and Stewart would. He would listen to friends basically more than he would me. So, which I do mention in the book. I mean, I have a lot of time for Andy. I think he was a great guitar player and he was a essential element, but I wish he had listened more because I could have done better for him had he listened. But sometimes I would say he was one of these artists that, you had to tell him what he wanted to hear.
I imagine, Miles, that there are plenty of management decisions that you made which might not have been agreed upon, by the whole band and vice versa, which brings me to Zenyatta Mondatta, because that record was made under huge pressure due to touring commitments, which just about overlapped studio time. And Andy has talked about how disruptive that was, but at the same time, he's agreed that the album really stands up. I wondered what drove the decision to cram in so much at the risk of compromising that record at that time, or did you just have 100% confidence that the band would nail that album?
Well, you book tours, you're expecting albums to be done, everybody's chasing after you. Everybody's got a good idea. Everybody's got, it's just, in a way, it's, strike while the iron is hot, because success is fleeting. If you stay away too long from the marketplace, you're forgotten. So a lot of times things are thrust upon you and you basically do the best you can. Was it, if you could go back and do it over again, would you do it differently? Well, probably you would, a little bit differently, but a lot of things sort of thrust upon you at the time and you have really no choice. The record company was pushing for another record. The market was pushing, the band, and there was a finite period in which the band was going to stay together. So in a way, if I could do it all over again, I would have encouraged them to put more songs down so we'd have more on tape. That would have been the one thing I would have done, so that I could have said, well, after the group's broken up, well, we've got 20 songs still in the can we can release at some point in the future. When the police finally sort of called a stop, there was nothing left. We put everything out.
So there's not a lot of material that you remember being recorded that wasn't put on records.
Yeah, we pretty much used everything. I mean, it weren't like, it would have been great to have, a backlog of some 30, 40 songs in the can that we could then kind of put out later on as, the police rediscovered for the 5th time,
Legend has it, Miles, that an album of 1950s covers was at least planned at one point.
Well, we talked about a lot of things, because, there's a limit to how many songs Sting can write, We talked about, do we do, covers? Do we do any number of things? Were they deep, well thought out conversations? No, they could have been things thrown out, it's like, well, maybe we'll get around to that one day, But the reality is the police didn't last long enough for us to do all of those things.
You talked about, a sense that the police were a finite entity. And was there a point during, before the Montserrat sessions, was there a point when you realized, yeah, this has definitely got an endpoint?
No, I would not have allowed myself to think that.
That makes me wonder about how tough it must have been when the police stopped making records and stopped touring.
Well, we never really announced the day that it was over. We kept thinking that one day we'd kind of reassemble, But once Sting's solo career was doing well, it's like, well, why does he need to redo the Police? Because now he's got the freedom to do the songs as he wants with musicians that are absolutely chosen by him. And you know what, he's doing pretty well. So why does he need the Police?
There's some questions that I'll ask about, that point at which, there was that last tour during the mid-'80s. Just before I get there, the Police did a few soundtrack pieces for Brimstone and Treacle, which I still think is Sting's best performance. And that film really holds up, and the music holds up. And I wondered, why didn't the Police do more? Because they worked so well as a soundtracking unit for that film.
Well, soundtracks don't make a lot of money, and if you're going to put the time into making records, you make albums for the band. Why make albums for a movie that isn't that successful? So most soundtracks don't do very well. So yeah, we could have done a number of things. We just didn't.
That's fair enough. The Police music videos I wanted to ask you about as well, Marl. They all had this really wonderful impromptu, hey, we've got a spare 5 minutes in backstage, let's cut a video kind of vibe to them. Evidently budget conscious and practical, but I think that could be afforded because those three guys have such compelling personalities and they all look great. I wondered, can you talk about the decision to go big budget in 1983 for the singles for Synchronicity?
Well, part of it has to do with the success of the band. The record company gives you the budget and you work within it. The other thing about the Police is part of we were selling was the personality of the band. So sometimes sort of formula big budget videos, in a way the tail wags the dog. Well, really, we saw with the Go-Go's, I think their video cost, I don't know, $8,000 or $9,000, but it captures the spirit of the girls, and in a way, that's what you want a video to do. You're selling personality as much as you are, some sort of visual escapism, I mean, Duran Duran, for instance, did videos where they're out in fancy boats and looking all amazing and this and that. That had a particular appeal, selling, fame and success in Monte Carlo or something, whereas the Police vibe was very much of the people, same as the sort of Go-Go's, and we were looking at things where they were the genuineness and the personality of the band was part of the appeal. Yeah,
completely. The last time the Police toured before the reunion in 2007, 2008 was in 1986 for Amnesty International. And legend has it that you played a major part in the decision for the Police to headline those last 3 Amnesty shows, and that it was a pretty tough negotiation. I wondered, how did those 3 headline spots come to be, given that U2 were also on the bill?
Well, I think U2 recognized the fact that the Police, being a sort of legendary group, I mean, they became legendary themselves, and were very rightfully, strong artists in their own right. But for the police, it was kind of a unique situation. Whereas U2 weren't, they were going to continue for some time afterwards, whereas the police were not. So I think U2 were gracious enough to understand that, so yeah, there was a bit of negotiation, who's really bigger and this and that. But I think U2 were smart enough to say, well, this is unique. Let the police headline, I always thought that Bono was one of the true artists that actually understood the dynamics and was actually a real guy, so he's one of the other guys I actually quite liked in the business and respected, he and Springsteen and a couple of others, and I think the thing about U2 that was really quite good was that, they stuck it out all this time, basically with the same manager, a long, long time, with the same format, the same lineup, the same, they didn't get caught up in some of the things that the police did, in a sense, so every band has its own dynamic. And I think the police, it was a special moment for them, and it was rightful that they closed the shows.
There's something of a changing of the guard that takes place in the video that's been released of one of those last performances with the guitar being handed over to the Edge, and it seems really fitting. It's like there's a real acknowledgement that the police have they left the stage with their legacy intact and were changing over the guard to the next biggest band in the world.
Yeah, I think that's always going to happen, one way or another, I mean, you're not going to be big forever, and I think the police were old enough to recognize the fact that, take it when you can get it, and it's not going to be forever. I remember Sting saying to me once, be nice to the people on your way up because you may need them on your way down. I think they always had a kind of a view of fame, that it was something that was, fine when you've got it, but it may not always be the same.
You put the Police's final studio recording session together, which was for the purposes of giving the label a couple of fresh tracks to include on a greatest hits package. And my sense is that you had to engage in a pretty strategic negotiation with the band to pull that off, given that it was pretty clear by then that the Police weren't going to record another album. How did you make that happen?
Well, I'd have to, go back now. You're talking going back, 20, 30 years, so you're saying, well, you do what you have to do, basically, it was not ideal. I would have rather had some new songs, but there weren't any really, so we made do with what we had, and it is what it is. It was what it was.
It's well known that on the eve of recording, Stewart fell off a horse and broke his collarbone. And I've always wondered, why didn't they just reschedule the recording session for after his collarbone had healed?
I can't even remember why. Could have been a time commitment or something. I don't really know. I can't answer that question.
All right. Well, Andy Summers has recently talked in interviews about a 10-year plan to release new archival Police material, starting with a Regatta de Blanc box set and a restored version of Around the World. And that'll be the first time that any archival Police material has seen the light of day since the Police Live double album was released back in 1995. What do you think has taken so long for such a archival release to see the light of day, especially when you consider the multitude of legacy releases from similarly iconic artists of that era and before?
Well, you've got to get all three members together. They've all got to agree, which is sometimes more difficult than you would imagine. So Sting's got his own career to worry about. Andy's got a career and Stewart's got a career. And so I think a lot of them sort of, well, in the case of Sting, it's like, well, I've been there, done that. Why do I need to keep regurgitating the past? Maybe it's fine for the fans, but why do I care? I did what I did. If they're interested in what we did in the past, let them buy the records we did then. Stuart and Andy may have a different view because they make less money than Sting, for instance. But the reality is, you've got to get 3 people to agree, plus me, about all the details. And there are a lot of people who object to that, for one reason or another. Everybody wants to have their say, or have their hand in it, or have their piece of it. So it's not just, the artists themselves. It's also the manager who happens to be there, the lawyer, the this, the that, who all, who all have their 2 cents to play. I mean, that's part of the tragedy of the police, is that, it would have been nice if we were all sort of intact. But the reality is, I mean, I haven't talked to Andy in 10 years, and I haven't talked to Sting in this probably the same time, and the reality is, they did what they did. And I don't think that they have a huge interest in reliving the past, because they're doing fine.
Fair enough. Miles, my closing question for you is about that photograph. I believe John sent it along. Have you seen it? If you haven't, I've got a copy of it here.
Yeah, it's a photograph of me holding a, I can't remember. I think that was, I was trying to remember where that was from, I don't know, some event, who knows?
Probably my favorite Miles shot.
Well, we played on various things, with the police, with the name, the band, Stuart came up with the name. Somebody asked him, why do you call the band the Police? And he said, because cars around the world are all advertising my band. My father formed the CIA. My record company was IRS Records. My brother Ian's agency was FBI. So we all sort of played with this sort of, military stroke governmental. We were rebels, yet we used analogies. We used names that were very establishment. So it was the yin and the yang. And so, that was always part of the mystique of what we were doing. And the name Outlandos D'Amour, which I came up with, it was the Outlandos it was really playing with the word commando and outlaw. We were stripped down. It was 3 people in the band. It was as, minimal as you could get. And we were sort of outlaws, but yet we were also part of the established, so it was a mixture of things. So Outlandos was a marriage of the word commando and outlaw, which sounded a bit too rough. So I softened it with the word d'amour. The Outlandos of, like the outlaw commandos of love. So it was the juxtaposition of opposites that were interesting. And in a way, that's what the Police was all about. It was juxtaposing opposites. Sting was a very methodical, strong formula songwriter. Stuart was this wild drummer. Andy was something in the middle. And you put the 3 together and you have something magical. And it worked.
Oh, it's a chemical reaction that took place.
Who had grown up in the Middle East, who had no business whatsoever being in the music business, you throw us all together and somehow we came up with the Police.
Well, the title of their last album, Synchronicity, seems to be a really fitting description of the entire career, including your career as a manager, because as you say in your book, it's not like you decided when you were a kid, oh yeah, I'm going to be a music manager when I grow up. It was kind of foisted upon you. It was a synchronous event. It was a synchronous event that the band got together in the first place. It's, as Sting often describes, it's all this series of wonderful accidents that's taken place.
Yeah, well, I think that's, a lot of lives are like that. You start off one way and you end up another. My father and used to say, I write that in the book. He used to say that, one of my strengths was that I was flexible. And I never really understood what he meant by that. He sort of wrote this tongue-in-cheek description of me, his son, as being flexible. And I realized, you know what? He actually was right, because, I kind of went with the flow, and the flow took me in the direction of the music business, which was the opposite of what I thought it would be, so, but I went with that flow. And as time went on, you reach a dead end, and you take a right turn or a left turn, and you take a left turn, and then you take a right turn, and you basically go with where you're going to go. And I was lucky that I guess I learned that to follow my instincts more than I would follow rules that were laid out in front of me. And that was probably why I ended up, reasonably successful, and probably warranted having a book,
I think there's a really important observations to make as well, because for someone from the outside who only knows Miles Copeland from those snippets of police videos and TV specials and interviews, is that there's so much more to you than just the unflappable pragmatist. There is so much instinct in how you've made decisions, and that flexibility that you talk about. I mean, that was evident, right from that point of bankruptcy when the Star Truckin' 75 tour went belly up. A lot of other people would have said, "Oh, well, fuck it, I've got to find another career." You found a way to turn the mistakes into learning. And I think that's a much better summation of you than the tough-nosed pragmatist, but a flexible, intuitive human being.
Well, I think one of the, like I said earlier, and I said in the book, and you mentioned earlier, if it bleeds, it leads. It's much more attractive and much more newsworthy to be somebody that's feared, and that there are exaggerations about, than be Mr. Nice Guy. If I was Mr. Nice Guy, be like, well, who wants to read that book? So in a way, when somebody would say, well, do you really want to be, known as somebody that's tough and, this and that, I would say, well, you know what, better that than Mr. Nice Guy, weak Mr. Marshmallow, because who's going to care about that? So the reality is that a lot of the press you get, whether it be a music star or a big industrialist or whatever, you're going to get a lot of negative things said about you. And in a way, that's positive, because in a way, the last thing you want is to be, Mr. Marshmallow, because that's just not interesting.
I like that, Mr. Marshmallow. On that, we'll close there, Miles. I'm so grateful for your time and for the opportunity to have this wonderful conversation with you. Thank you for your insights. And there have been surprises in this interview for me as well. So thank you for surprising me as well.
Well, it's been nice talking to you. You've asked a lot of intelligent questions, and, I hope I answered enough of them to make it interesting for you. So anyway, it was very nice talking to you.